to have another one of our wonderful Friday night insights. I guess I better turn the ball game off.
Goodness, Cheesh, Willie, I appreciate it. Okay, Hana. Okay, you Satini Sidikat Yuhan. Good evening, everybody. It's good to see all of you here. This evening, I'd like to tell you a story of how people from other continents first arrived in Southeast Alaska and how the Tlingit or Tlingit Nation met, responded to, and interacted with these visitors they called the Gus'k'iḳwáan, or the people at the base of the clouds. Before I begin telling this story, I would like to acknowledge that I'm giving this presentation on land near the mouth of Ketchikan Creek, which belongs to the Gus'k'iḳwáan clan of the Tlingit. I'm very grateful to be able to live in my beloved hometown of Ketchikan, which stretches across the lands of multiple clans of the Tlingit and the Saniakwáan, the Tongass and the Cape Fox people in Tlingit Tlingit country. Gus'k'iḳwáan, Tlingit, Saniakwáan, Tlingit kach. Peter Stanton, you hut to a sock. Glad ka washed on quan I hut, kitchunk ye hut yati. I carry the name Gus'k'iḳwáan as an adopted member of the Nanya'ai clan of the Tlingit, or the Stanton people. My name is Peter Stanton. I'm a white American who grew up in Ketchikan, and I'm a social studies teacher at Ketchikan High School. I feel very honored and grateful that the Cape Fox Cultural Foundation asked me to present yet again as part of the Friday Night Insight programs here at the Discovery Center. Gus'k'iḳwáan to them and Gus'k'iʔwáan to the Forest Service for hosting so many of these great programs so that people are able to share knowledge with the community. I'm also very grateful to all of you for coming this evening and being willing to spend a Friday evening listening to a history lecture. That's a wonderful thing. Many of you may know that I've been working on a manuscript about Tlingit history for the past several years, and each of my Friday Night Insight presentations has been largely based on one chapter from that manuscript. In 2023, it was chapter 5 about how Tlingit faced down attacks from the U.S. Army during the years of 1867 to 1877. In 2024, my presentation was mostly based on chapter 4 about the years of 1840 to 1867. Last year, I mostly used chapter 6 to focus on the history of how capitalism arrived here in Tlingit. And tonight's presentation goes backward chronologically to chapter 2. Clearly, I'm running out of chapters here, and I need to get that manuscript finished, which I do plan to do as soon as I can. Also bear in mind that what I present tonight is most of chapter 2, but I did have to cut out various parts in order to keep my speaking less than an hour. So if it seems like I skip over a certain topic tonight, it may be that I have written about it, but I just couldn't include it tonight for the sake of time. And lastly, I do want to emphasize that I continue to be a Skunwan of Tlingit Shagun, a student of Tlingit history. Please forgive me if you hear any mistakes, any misstatements, or any misinterpretations of this history, or if anything I say this evening causes offense. That is not at all my intention, and I very much welcome any feedback or corrections that you can offer as I continue my research and writing. With all of that said, I hope you enjoy the story of Tlingit history and the strangers who sailed to Southeast Alaska in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, the Gus'k'iʔwáan. In 1741, a Russian ship under the command of Alexei Chirikov briefly stopped in Tlingit, the first European ship to ever sail into these waters. After that event, news must have spread among the Tlingit and their neighbors of these large foreign vessels that were now visiting their shores. 15 of Chirikov's men had disappeared after going ashore in small boats. And Tlingit oral history shared by Gus'k'iʔwáan Mark Jacobs Jr. told that there were 8 Russians who decided to join the Tlingit. They then moved south to live among the people of the Tlingit on Tonga, or Prince of Wales Island. The deserters from Chirikov's ship who agreed to join Tlingit society married, acculturated, and must have shared knowledge about the iron weapons and other objects that they brought with them. They may have also communicated what they understood about the power and ambitions of the Russians and their empire, and they may have warned the Tlingit about the possible consequences of future voyages. However, it took more than a generation before any other strange sailing vessel arrived in Tlingit, and this time it was the Spanish, not the Russians, who journeyed into Tlingit waters. In August 1775, a 38-foot two-masted schooner named the Sonora, captained by Juan Francisco de la Bodega y Cuadra, arrived at Gus'k'iḳwáan, at the Gus'k'iḳwáan Tlingit community called Gus'k'iḳwáan, or Sea Lion Cove, located on Kruzof Island. Tonight, I do not have the time to discuss the attempted Russian colonization of Tlingit, or Tlingit country, during the late 18th and early 19th centuries. Instead, I will describe and analyze how Tlingit responded to the other foreigners who sailed into their waters in the decades after 1775, and how these encounters fueled changes within and around Tlingit. The Tlingit called these visitors the Gus'k'iḳwáan, or the people at the base of the clouds, these people arriving on the horizon beneath billowing sails. Tlingit clans met, learned from, and dealt with captains and crews of imperial and commercial voyages from the Spanish, French, and British empires and the United States of America. In analyzing the Tlingit oral histories and foreign accounts of these encounters between the Tlingit and the Gus'k'iḳwáan, it is apparent that Tlingit most often approached the visitors with curiosity, hospitality, and eagerness to trade. Tlingit attitudes changed, however, when foreigners imposed on that Tlingit hospitality or threatened the security of Tlingit individuals and property. Using the new wealth, goods, and technologies they acquired from the alien vessels in their waters, Tlingit households increased their economic productivity. Clans expanded their political objectives, leaders rose in prominence, and artists became more prolific. European ships brought with them a wide array of unprecedented opportunities, but also unprecedented threats. The Tlingit nation had entered a new era of its history, an era filled with both riches and tragedy. In the 1770s, Spanish officials were alarmed to hear of Russian activities in the North Pacific, and in response, they sent voyages north from a new port named San Blas on what is now the Pacific coast of Mexico. I should make clear that the crews of these Spanish ships were not exclusively Spanish in ethnicity. Many on board were Filipino sailors who manned the trans-Pacific voyages of Spain's Manila galleons, as well as men of indigenous and African ancestry who were recruited in colonial Mexico. Even in leadership positions, individuals like Alejandro or Alessandro Malespina, as well as several of the officers who served under him, came not from Spain, but Italy. Tlingit interactions with these men serving the Spanish Empire were brief, spanning a period of less than 20 years, and the Spanish proved unable to make any meaningful claim to indigenous lands in Northwest North America. Nonetheless, the Spanish voyages to Tlingit and the Northwest Coast had significant and in some cases devastating effects on many Native communities. In 1775, the Sonora became the first European vessel to reach Tlingit, or present-day Southeast Alaska, by crossing Dixon Entrance. Bodega y Cuadra wrote that he, quote, proceeded to take possession with a landing party at Gus'k'iḳwáan, and his crew raised a cross on a hill, and they, quote, performed all the requisite formalities. Tlingit were living nearby, and quite quickly after the Spanish reboarded the Sonora, they took down the cross and brought it to what Bodega y Cuadra called their stockade, the Gus'k'iḳwáan fort or settlement at Gus'k'iḳwáan. The next day, when Bodega y Cuadra and his crew went ashore for water, Tlingit and Spanish interacted face-to-face for the first time. They successfully communicated their friendly intentions and began to trade. However, when the Tlingit saw the strangers were carrying away casks full of water, and when the gifts the Spanish offered as compensation were rejected as insufficient, the Tlingit brought out their spears. The Spanish only left the shore with their casks of water after threatening the Tlingit with their muskets. From the start of their interactions with the Gus'k'iḳwáan, Tlingit were willing to welcome strangers and exchange goods with them, but just as would have been the case for any other indigenous nation or outside clan visiting their territory, they would not accept any stranger taking their resources without paying an appropriate fee. The same patterns continued when the Spanish returned to Tlingit in 1779. 2 ships stayed for over a month in the area they named Bucareli Bay, a sheltered body of water on the west coast of Tongan in Tlingit territory. The Tlingit Tlingit were immediately willing to carry out extensive trade with the Spanish, but tensions rose as the Spanish overstayed their welcome and helped themselves to Tlingit resources, while Tlingit repeatedly took Spanish goods. When 2 Spanish sailors deserted, their officers, perhaps unable to believe or accept that the men would desert to go live with indigenous peoples in a strange land, assumed the sailors had been taken captive. Then the Spanish took 2 Tlingit hostages, and when more Tlingit canoes approached, the foreigners opened fire and tried to capture even more Tlingit. The Spanish used grape shot and sunk multiple canoes. According to the officers' accounts, they only killed 1 Tlingit outright, but they admitted others could have drowned. The Spanish then brought the surviving 19 men, women, and children out of the water, took them on board their ship with the other 2 hostages, and gave them gifts in an attempt to make peace. In the previous weeks of commerce, various Tlingit individuals had sold 5 enslaved children to the Spanish officers and chaplains, 2 girls and 3 boys, the oldest about 9 or 10 years old. At least part of the Spanish rationale for engaging in slave trading was that they would be rescuing these children and saving their souls by converting them to Christianity. The pilot of one of the ships recorded a story about one of these children, the oldest boy. When the Spanish shot at the Tlingit canoes near their ship, the boy took the hands of the Spanish soldiers and led them to the muskets and other weapons on board, making signs that the soldiers should attack the Tlingit canoes. It's intriguing to consider whether this child may have resented the Tlingit who had enslaved him and wanted the Spanish to enact some sort of vengeance. After the Spanish opened fire, killing at least 1 Tlingit, and held over 20 Tlingit hostages on their vessel, the Tlingit certainly must have been on the verge of going to war with these intruders. As 4 small Spanish boats approached the shore carrying the Tlingit hostages, they saw the beach was crowded with heavily armed Tlingit wearing armor and bearing shields, spears, and bows. But in this intense moment, the Tlingit leaders agreed to a hostage exchange, even though the deserters had never truly been hostages. The Tlingit retrieved the Spanish deserters, and the exchange was made. Quadra wrote that once the Spanish had their sailors back, he, quote, caused them to make confession, and the deserters were punished with 100 lashes each and imprisoned in the hold of the ship. Unlike Chirikov, who never found the men who abandoned his ship in 1741, the Spanish officers did not allow their crew to escape their duties so easily to find a new, more liberated life among the Tlingit. The anthropologist Wallace Olson wrote that Tlingit-Spanish interactions in the late 18th century occurred, quote, without the tragedy that usually followed such meetings, end quote, referring to other confrontations between Spanish and indigenous peoples throughout history. It is noteworthy that there was little violent conflict between Tlingit and the Spanish sailors who entered their waters, and the death toll from their encounters was possibly only 1 person, the 1 Tlingit shot in their canoe at Bucareli Bay. Olson concludes that the relative lack of violence that took place during these interactions between Spanish and Tlingit was due to the actions of, quote, honorable men and women on both sides. He supported this claim by pointing to orders that Spanish officers gave to their men that they should act favorably toward the Tlingit. They treated guests and hostages on board their ships hospitably, giving them food and gifts, beds in the officers' quarters, and musical entertainment. At first, when Tlingit took small items from the Spanish ships and camp at Bucareli Bay, the sailors were ordered to ignore these actions that they saw as thefts. Later, however, they did react with anger and indignation and used force to coerce Tlingit into returning items. The Tlingit, meanwhile, almost certainly viewed taking items from the Spanish as a form of compensation or rent that they were entitled to. The foreigners were, after all, staying on their land and freely taking the wood, water, and other resources that were theirs. It is true that the Spanish officers' orders and attitude toward interacting with the Tlingit must have reduced the opportunities for conflict. However, when moments between Tlingit and their foreign visitors became tense, such as when the Spanish demanded the return of the deserters and fired upon Tlingit canoes, it was ultimately the patience, sense of honor, and common sense of Tlingit leaders that kept the violence from escalating. And the picture here is a later Spanish drawing from 1791 of a Tlingit warrior in full armor with bow and arrow. Olson's statement that Tlingit Spanish encounters occurred without the tragedy that usually followed such meetings may also discount the tragic and traumatic effects of diseases that the Spanish voyages likely carried with them. It is difficult to say with certainty when the first epidemic diseases from Eurasia may have reached the northwest coast and Tlingit. It is possible that smallpox and other infectious diseases brought to the Americas by Europeans in the early 16th century may have spread all the way to Tlingit centuries before Tlingit ever met the Gus'k'iḳwáan, if those diseases were transmitted through the extensive indigenous trade networks that led to the northwest coast. However, it is still important to consider whether the 1775 and 1779 Spanish voyages carried new epidemics with them. The 1775 visit of the Sonora to Gus'k'iḳwáan territory appears particularly suspect because people of the Gus'k'iḳwáan testified to later visitors that they had lost many of their number to disease around 1780, and it was observed that many Tlingit in the area had pockmarked faces, signature evidence of smallpox. It is also clear from later testimonies that there was substantial population decline among the Gus'k'iḳwáan around 1780, soon after the Spanish spent over a month in their territory and interacted closely with so many Tlingit. Bodega y Cuadra estimated on one day in 1779 that he had seen canoes passing by his ship filled with, quote, over 1,000 persons. In stark contrast, when the Spanish returned to Bucareli Bay 13 years later in 1792, an officer wrote that the area was, quote, only very thinly populated, end quote, and the expedition saw no more than 40 natives at a time. If the Spanish ships did infect the Tlingit with smallpox or other diseases in the 1770s, it may have been the first time Europeans had directly transmitted diseases to the northwest coast, and the first time Tlingit had ever been exposed to such diseases. However, the evidence implicating the Spanish is circumstantial, and it remains possible that the diseases that afflicted the Gus'k'iḳwáan and Gus'k'iʔwáan around 1780 arrived, in fact, by indigenous canoes, not European sailing ships. Regardless, however smallpox and other diseases first came to Tlingit in the northwest coast, whether it was on Spanish ships or not, these would have been the first in a series of frequent, near uncountable tragedies that would kill untold thousands of people. Every epidemic had brutal ramifications for the communities afflicted, not only a human cost and a social cost, but political impacts as well. As in many other parts of the Americas, indigenous nations were ravaged by foreign diseases, before colonial powers truly attempted to conquer them. Ultimately, the most important reason that interactions between Tlingit and Spanish were relatively friendly was that the Spanish did not have the ability to truly attempt to colonize Tlingit. Later examples of British and Russian activities in Tlingit demonstrate that violence between Tlingit and Europeans became much more likely when the foreigners built fortifications in Tlingit territory, allied with Tlingit enemies, interfered in Tlingit political affairs, or threatened Tlingit trade. While the Spanish may have brought devastation to the Tlingit and other peoples of the Northwest Coast in the form of diseases, these would-be colonizers did not have the power or resources to stay and genuinely threaten the sovereignty of indigenous communities in the region. Another Spanish voyage visited Tlingit in 1791, but much of this expedition's justification was the ideals of Enlightenment science, following in the wake of British and French Pacific exploration. The Spanish spent 10 days at Yakutat Bay, where artists painted scenes of the Gus'k'iḳwáan, their kutia or totem poles, and their houses. A Czech botanist collected plants and also transcribed a piece of Tlingit music he called a hymn of peace. And there's a video that you can find on YouTube of a wonderful presentation done by Steve Langdon, Maria Shawclaw-Williams, and Judy Dahutsu Ramos about this music that is called Voices of the Ancestors, Inquiries Concerning Tlingit Singing at Yakutat in 1791. A group of Spanish officers also stole a Tlingit mortuary box from a burial ground with ashes and bones of a deceased person still inside, an early example of European desire to steal and collect the incredible artistry of the Northwest Coast. Pictured here is an incredible headdress frontlet taken by the Spanish. I'm not sure whether they paid for it or not. And I'm just amazed by the work produced by Tlingit artists in the late 18th century. Unfortunately, there is no record of what happened to the mortuary box that was stolen. It did not end up in the Museo de America in Madrid like some of the other items like this frontlet from this 1791 expedition did. The final Spanish voyage to pass through the waters of Tlingit came in 1792. And 3 years later, the Spanish abandoned the settlement they had established on Vancouver Island. Despite their best efforts to project power into the North Pacific, the Spanish Empire was shut out of the lands north of California by Russian and British colonial projects and American commercial prowess. A European power that sent voyages to Tlingit over an even shorter span of time than Spain was France. Despite their limited impact, the experiences and records of these French sailors still provide important insights into Tlingit history. The French had become interested in the North Pacific after receiving accounts of the Spanish voyages and the third voyage of British Captain James Cook. In August 1785, 2 ships left France under the command of Jean-François de Gallo de la Pérouse. The voyage had a stated mission of scientific discovery, as well as secret political missions to spy on other European powers and make a colonial claim for France. In June 1786, La Pérouse's ships reached the shores of Tlingit, and in July they entered Tlingit, or Lituya Bay, a natural harbor on the Gulf Coast in the territory of the Hunakawu. The French soon met some Tlingit in the bay who likely belonged to the Tukdengtan, a branch of the Tlingit clan. The French anchored in Tlingit for weeks, and they grew frustrated, as had the Spanish before them, with what they perceived as the ongoing theft of expedition supplies by the Tlingit, who took items they found when they were on board the foreign ship or visiting their camp. The Tlingit had a different conception of property and perceived that the French owed them payment for using their resources, since the water, wood, and other supplies the expedition was taking were Tlingit property. The Tlingit saw the French trade goods and other items that they took as an appropriate fee for the foreigners to stay on their land. The French were staying on a small island in the bay, and the fact that the Tlingit knew the value of their land was further demonstrated when a leader offered to sell the island to La Pérouse. This event was likely the first instance in which Tlingit had ever offered to sell their land to Europeans. Although Tlingit clans had long practiced selling or gifting land to other clans or indigenous nations, particularly as a means to resolve conflicts. La Pérouse made the purchase, but his own preconceived notions of indigenous cultures made him doubt the legitimacy of the sale. He wrote, quote, "It is more than doubtful that the chief was the owner of any land at all. The government of these people is so democratic that the country must belong to the whole society." There is a kernel of truth in the Frenchman's statement, in that the island did not belong to a single individual, as a European monarch or nobleman might possess a fiefdom and do with it what he wished. Instead, the island was the communal property of an entire clan, likely the Tuk-Dainton of the Gus'k'iḳwáan. However, communal ownership did not prevent the Tlingit from having strong beliefs in property rights, nor did it stop a leader from making a sale of land on behalf of the clan he represented. Clearly, the French did not grasp how the Tlingit political system and property ownership worked. In any case, Tlingit managed to profit from this encounter, selling the island in Situa to foreigners who would never return to it. Here's a drawing of the two French ships in Situa. You can see them visited there by Tlingit canoes. A second French voyage visited Tlingit in 1791, commanded by Etienne Marchand. Marchand's voyage was a private commercial venture intended to profit from the growing trans-Pacific fur trade. In August 1791, the French entered Sitka Sound, and the Gus'k'iḳwáan Tlingit in canoes found the ship after several days. By this time, Tlingit, especially those in southern Tlingit and on the outer coast of the archipelago, like the Gus'k'iḳwáan, were well accustomed to trading furs with foreign ships. The Gus'k'iḳwáan brought many furs to Marchand and were prepared to purchase all sorts of copper and iron items and European clothing. The Tlingit also communicated to Marchand that if he stayed in Sitka Sound for 10 more days, they would be sure to go and, quote, "speedily return with a fresh stock of furs," end quote, which was a promise they followed through on. The French also observed that the Tlingit possessed relatively few firearms at this time, although they correctly predicted that this state of affairs would soon change. The Europeans and Americans who sailed to the Northwest coast in the late 18th century made a wide range of observations and formed many different beliefs about the indigenous peoples there, including stereotypes and prejudices. A British trader wrote that the Tlingit were, quote, "very easily irritated and would very little scruple to kill you when they think themselves injured," end quote. However, the examples of the Spanish and French voyages to Tlingit from 1775 to 1792 demonstrate that violence was not the first or most typical response Tlingit had to the strange new ships and visitors in their waters. In fact, Tlingit did not kill a single person on any of these 6 Spanish and French voyages, and the only Spanish and French sailors to die in Tlingit died of disease and drowning. Instead of turning immediately to violence, Tlingit were overwhelmingly curious about the practices, knowledge, and material wealth of foreigners, and they aimed to learn as much about them as they could. Accompanying that curiosity was a desire for material benefit, and Tlingit engaged in trade with their visitors that was almost always mutually beneficial, although the Tlingit would push every bargain as far as they could. Marchand commented on how expertly the Tlingit examined European wares and used every detail to inform their bargaining, saying, quote, "the smallest defect escapes not the first glance of their eye, but makes them lessen the price of the article or determines them to reject it entirely," end quote. Tlingit followed their own system of justice and would take action if they were harmed or if their laws were broken. Their practices were not irrationally aggressive. Indeed, Tlingit showed a great deal of patience and diplomacy in meeting with foreign ships and navigated expertly through the enormous cultural differences and communication difficulties that existed between themselves and the visitors. When Tlingit threatened to use violence, it was only when they had been wronged and no peaceful settlement was reached. In the Tlingit justice system, when legal settlements went unpaid, payment needed to be taken by force. The British came to the west coast of North America in the late 18th and early 19th centuries from multiple directions. The Tlingit soon came to call them Gus'k'iḳwáan, from the Chinookwáwa or Chinook jargon term based on the words King George men. Like the Spanish and French, the Gus'k'iḳwáan sent long-distance voyages of exploration to the North Pacific that sailed through the islands of Tlingit. But unlike the Spanish and French, British merchant ships also participated extensively in the trans-Pacific fur trade on the northwest coast. It was the third and final voyage of British Captain James Cook that ignited the explosive commercial frenzy of the fur trade on the northwest coast of North America. Cook's mission was to explore the North Pacific for the British Empire, but in 1778, members of his crew bought sea otter pelts from the Nuu-chah-nulth people on Vancouver Island and Dena'ina in Tikotnu, commonly known as Cook Inlet, in exchange for iron and glass beads. Then, when Cook's crew reached Guangzhou, or Canton, China, the men were able to sell the pelts for enormous profits. The crewmen were able to sell a single sea otter pelt for a price as high as 120 Spanish dollars, which was an amount more than twice as much as a year of a sailor's wages. As soon as it became widely known what profits could be made, merchants began planning voyages from London, Boston, and other ports around the world to acquire furs on the northwest coast and sell them in China. And here I had to include this picture of a suit of ceremonial Chinese armor that I saw at a museum in the Netherlands. I noticed it had sea otter fur lining, and based on when this armor was made, it seems almost certain that the sea otter fur came from the northwest coast. In the 1780s, approximately 30 British and American ships sailed the oceans in this endeavor. Although there were exceptions, there was little question for these merchants that the most efficient way to acquire the furs was to buy them from local indigenous peoples, not to hunt sea otters themselves or hire contract hunters. The quest for furs along the Pacific coast of North America extended across the entirety of the sea otter's range, from Baja California to the Bering Sea. However, Tlingit proved to be a critical region for the trade, not only because of its substantial area, but because the strength of Tlingit clans kept their trade from being monopolized by a single imperial power. Tlingit therefore kept their furs on offer to merchants from multiple nations for an extended period of time. In the early years of the Trans-Pacific fur trade, most of the ships coming to the northwest coast were British in origin. However, as powerful as the Gus'k'iḳwáan, their navy, and their merchant fleet were in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, the British government had created obstacles that made it difficult for their subjects to fully exploit the Trans-Pacific trade. The King's government had granted the South Sea Company the monopoly over British trade in the Pacific, but granted its East India Company the monopoly over trade in China. British voyages had to decide whether they would strictly follow the law by acquiring licenses and paying fees to both of these companies, or attempt to make do with a license from just one company, or go unlicensed altogether. In part because the British merchant ships were hampered by their empire system of trade monopolies, it was traders from the newly independent United States of America that came to dominate the fur trade on the northwest coast from the 1790s to roughly the 1830s. The men from New England sailing into the Pacific had no idea that their country's borders might someday reach that ocean's shores, although some imagined it would. A few Americans attempted to establish outposts on the northwest coast, such as John Kendrick, who negotiated land purchases with the Moachot people of the Nuchalnuth Nation on Vancouver Island in 1791. Nonetheless, as American sailors arrived in Pacific waters, the vast majority had no desire to conquer or settle the land or make any imperial claim. Instead, they sailed for profit. Because most of the American ships sailed from Boston or other New England ports, the word Boston became the basis for their name in Chinukwawa, the language that came to be used for trade all along the coast. In Tlingit, the word became Washton, and so the American people were called Gus'k'iḳwáan. By the final years of the 18th century, the Gus'k'iḳwáan had become the main trade partners of the Tlingit. American merchants responded to the desires and demands of indigenous fur suppliers in ways that others had not, which changed the nature and consequences of the trade. The Gus'k'iḳwáan did not hesitate to sell advanced weapons to indigenous nations on the northwest coast, including the best muskets that could be had for purchase in Europe or anywhere else around the world. More than anything else, this willingness was fueled by fierce competition to keep indigenous fur traders or fur suppliers happy in order for the merchants to make the massive profits they hoped for in China. In addition, it helped that the United States laid no claim to the Northwest coast at this time, and the natives generally had little reason to use firearms against Americans who were their major trade partners. Not to mention, the merchants expected their native fur suppliers would use the muskets to hunt for even more furs. The typical firearms bought by indigenous peoples through the fur trade were smoothbore, muzzle-loading flintlock muskets, similar to the Brown Bess used during the American Revolution. Tlingit bought these military-grade muskets, as well as Northwest Coast trade guns that were modified according to native preferences for lighter, shorter firearms. Prices varied by trader, location, and throughout the years of the fur trade, but at the time that Tlingit American trading was perhaps reaching its frenzied peak, around the year 1800, a single sea otter pelt could purchase one musket, 3 or 4 pounds of powder, and 6 to 8 pounds of shot. Some scholars have proposed that due to their long reload time and inaccuracy, European firearms of this area were not inherently superior to bows and arrows. However, it is clear from historical accounts across North America that even if firearms did not replace bows and other tools instantaneously or in every use case, indigenous peoples immediately recognized the power of gunpowder technology. They sought to acquire it, and they aimed to keep it out of the hands of their rivals. The Tlingit leveraged what they had, the wealth of fur-bearing animals in Tlingit and their control over trade routes with interior regions, to buy as many weapons as they could. One Russian officer wrote that the Tlingit, quote, are so cunning and careful that they tell the Americans they will agree to carry out trade in sea otters only if their ships bring a known quantity of arms and the equipment associated with them. And if not, they will not trade them even one otter, end quote. Although they were not driven by a capitalistic profit motive like their foreign trade partners, the Tlingit were ruthless and effective traders, and they recognized how acquiring new tools like firearms would enable them to raise their prestige, strengthen their clans, and provide for their security. American traders' willingness to meet their Tlingit suppliers' needs even reached the point where they sold small cannons to Tlingit. In 1799, Alexander Baranov saw that the Gus'k'iḳwáan owned at least 4 falconets that could fire 1-pound cannonballs, and he heard that Tlingit had higher caliber artillery elsewhere. When the Russians laid claim to Tlingit, American traders were unafraid of continuing to sell arms to the Tlingit, even under the very gaze of the Russian fort at Sitka. The Tlingit, meanwhile, understood that in the strange new circumstances they found themselves in, As ships loaded with cannon sailed freely through their waters, they might not be able to rely only on muskets to defend their interests and sovereignty. It was a bold, intelligent move to gain more firepower. By the start of the 19th century, and I've verified this statement with an expert in the field, the Tlingit clans with the best access to the fur trade were among the best armed indigenous peoples in all of North America. Pictured here is a small cannon in the Sealaska Heritage Institute collections in Juneau that I was just able to see a few weeks ago. I know that there are other cannons that were kept throughout Tlingit, including in Saxman, and they are amazing testaments to this history. In their eagerness to make quick profits and acquire as much of the fur supply as possible, the Americans also sold their trade goods at cheaper prices, or rather, used them to pay higher prices for furs, and brought much higher quantities of goods to indigenous nations than the British, Russians, or others had. The Gus'k'iḳwáan brought many other things besides weapons to the Northwest Coast and Tlingit. These goods included cloth, clothing, sugar, axes, knives, other metal items, and even enslaved human beings. And although the capture and trade of enslaved people on the Northwest Coast continued to be conducted almost entirely by indigenous nations, it should come as no great surprise that some Gus'k'iḳwáan merchants participated in slave trading in the region as well, given how much the United States profited from the slave trade in the Atlantic. Not only did some American captains purchase and transport enslaved people, but at least one captain kidnapped people at the mouth of the Columbia River and sold them into slavery farther north. Although one scholar concluded that the first merchants to sell mass quantities of alcohol on the Northwest Coast were French, it is likely, given the quantity of trade they conducted, that the Americans were the ones to introduce alcohol to most Tlingit. The primary alcohol sold by the merchants was rum, or rather grog, because it was diluted with water. While Tlingit made powerful teas and medicines, they may have had a drink with intoxicating effects, they had nothing in their diet equivalent to distilled liquor before the Gus'k'iḳwáan arrived. According to one oral history, an American captain hosted a Tlingit Tequedi leader named Lingít on his ship, had him drink rum, and sent him on his way with another bottle. Lingít fell asleep drunk on shore, seriously alarming his family members who had never seen someone affected that way. When Lingít awoke the next morning, he decided to discard the rest of the American goods his people had acquired, seeing them as dangerous to their health. From the era of the fur trade onward, Tlingit would continue to have to navigate how to use or reject the technologies, ideas, and goods that these foreigners brought into their lives. Given that we're talking about the Tlingit, on this slide, I felt I really needed to include a picture of the Tlingit Kanáxidí pole in Saxman called the Proud Raven pole, which testifies to the Kanáxidí story of their first encounter with white men. And I did not have time tonight to properly discuss that story, that oral history, but I can recommend sources to look at for further information if you are interested. There is a long history of sailors traveling the world and seeking out sex, and the men who came to the Northwest Coast as part of the Trans-Pacific fur trade were no exception. Unlike other parts of the world, however, visited by European American sailors, where indigenous peoples were perceived as libertine and especially open about sexual matters, it appears the Tlingit maintained their strict class expectations and generally shunned this type of interaction with foreigners. It seems that in most cases, Tlingit would instead make enslaved women available to sailors for sex and collect payment for these services. In this sphere, then, while Tlingit forced unfree members of their communities into sex work, they maintained their cultural expectations and boundaries for the rest of society, especially those with noble status. It appears that the broader patterns of Tlingit cultural and social life were not greatly shifted by the coming of the Gus'k'iḳwáan. While the materials and tools Tlingit had available to them changed greatly, from plentiful iron and copper to cotton and wool clothing to firearms, these materials and tools were used to continue or even strengthen the economic and social structures that already existed. Some scholars have portrayed the acquisition of European goods by indigenous peoples as if it inevitably led to an erosion or loss of indigenous traditions. However, such a narrative is undermined by the fact that it was already an indigenous tradition on the Northwest coast to trade for rare and beautiful objects from far away. Tlingit certainly spent more time acquiring furs than they would have done in the past because of the Gus'k'iḳwáan demand, but they still conducted their hunting and harvesting in a collective, clan-based and house-based manner. The hierarchical nature of Tlingit society also remained intact. While epidemic diseases certainly would have wreaked havoc on noble families, and the wealth produced by the fur trade likely allowed commoners to rise in status, the Tlingit noble class endured and carried on maintaining its privileges and responsibilities. It seems certain from the evidence available that Tlingit in the early 19th century hosted ku'ich or potlatches more frequently than their ancestors had due to the greater wealth that they had acquired to give away. It is up for debate as to whether it is appropriate for historians to call this era the classical period of Northwest Coast art, or to portray it as a golden age in which indigenous nations of the region reached a peak of artistic production. However, it is undeniable that there were numerous major artistic achievements during this time. For example, the career of the carver Kajistouach II from the Kiksedi of the Tlingit may have begun as early as 1775, before anyone from the Tlingit area had ever seen the Gus'k'iḳwáan, and lasted as late as the 1830s. During this storied career, Kajistouach was responsible for carving stunning house posts, screens, kutia, and other works that were commissioned by clans across Tlingit, from Tontoquan territory in the south to the Gus'k'iḳwáan in the north. Less certain, and subject to debate among scholars, are the claims that the increased wealth brought by the Trans-Pacific fur trade led to increased competition, conflict, violence, enslavement, and sacrifice among the indigenous nations of the Northwest Coast. There absolutely was competition over hunting and acquiring the pelts of sea otters and other fur-bearing mammals, and people struggled more for this resource as these populations declined. There is also evidence that the increased trade in furs led to enslaved people being trafficked more frequently and over greater distances. The traders of the Tlingit, for example, appear to have sought to acquire more enslaved people in the 1830s so they could sell them to the Tahltan nation for more furs coming out of that interior area. However, it is difficult to judge whether competition or conflict among people increased in absolute terms, especially given that the human population on the Northwest Coast continued declining through repeated demographic disasters during this time. To put it bluntly, as indigenous nations faced the horrors of epidemic diseases, the value of every human being in their communities increased, regardless of whether that person was noble, a commoner, or enslaved. I've included this picture in several of my previous Friday Night Insight presentations, but I just had to include, again, this COTS house post created by Stephen Jackson, because I think it so evocatively communicates the chaos and trauma that was caused by colonialism in Tlingit. But here are photos of 3 gos, or house posts, believed to have been carved by Kajistouach II during the late 18th and early 19th centuries, during this very time period. I'm not a carver, I'm not an anthropologist, I'm not an art historian, but I do think it is worth asking the question of whether incredible works like these were enabled or made easier by trade between Tlingit and Gus'k'iḳwáan. And that is what many anthropologists have typically claimed. It is the conventional narrative that I know as a tour guide at the Totem Heritage Center, that is something that I certainly repeated. But we've got to question whether Northwest Coast peoples would have been just as capable of producing these masterworks, even if the Gus'k'iḳwáan had never come to this land. And looking at some of those early pieces from the late 18th century that were taken by the Spanish, I've come to believe more and more that they had the tools, they had the artistic capabilities, and were already producing masterworks. It's just that we don't necessarily have the surviving evidence for all of those incredible works of art over thousands of years. Scholars have often concentrated on analyzing how European explorers and would-be colonizers observed and perceived native cultures. However, only considering how much visitors learned about indigenous nations is missing a critical part of the story: how much those indigenous nations learned about their visitors. In each case, when Tlingit encountered foreigners, they gathered knowledge about the ships in their waters and the people on board. Not all of this learning occurred in Tlingit either. Although such occurrences were rare during this time and information on their stories is limited, there were Tlingit individuals who seized opportunities to travel to new lands and see the societies where the Gus'k'iḳwáan came from. One man from the Tlingit, who came to be called Hanega Joe, boarded a Washdonquan ship as a youth, sailed to Boston, and learned English living in the United States. Later, he returned to Tlingit, became a leader in the Tlingit, and used his language and sailing skills for a time to work for the Hudson's Bay Company. Even when they did not visit foreign lands themselves or learn the foreigners' languages, many Tlingit were especially skilled in learning how to interact with and even take advantage of European and American visitors. Merchant ship captains complained constantly about the intelligence and shrewdness of indigenous traders, as seen in Cautionary Advice from 1787. Quote, "It appears that the natives are such intelligent traders that, should you be in the least degree lavish or inattentive in forming bargains, they will so enhance the value of their furs as not only to exhaust your present stock, but also to injure, if not ruin, any future adventure." End quote. The foreign merchants and sailors especially hated to negotiate with Tlingit women. Not only did trading with women violate these men's expectations of gender roles, but they also concluded that Tlingit women were even more shrewd and skillful in their bargaining than Tlingit men. Tlingit and other Northwest Coast peoples commonly believed that women should take the lead in managing a family's wealth and conducting trade, and they thought men had wasteful tendencies that women needed to keep in check. Therefore, a woman would usually accompany men on trading voyages, setting prices and ensuring good returns. Not only did the Trans-Pacific merchants have to worry about the prices their furs would fetch in China, but also the prices indigenous fur suppliers would demand. Enormous profits for the middlemen were certainly possible, but they were never guaranteed. While the European powers that had interests in colonizing northwestern North America attempted to learn about Tlingit culture and engaged in diplomacy with Tlingit leaders, the sailors of the Washdonquan were less interested in these activities. Given this contrast, it's worth examining the idea that conflict and violence between different nations in history is frequently the result of intercultural ignorance or misunderstanding. In spite of their general disinterest or disregard for seeking to understand the cultures of the Northwest Coast, the crews of the American ships that came to the Northwest Coast engaged in many mutual beneficial transactions with Tlingit. There certainly were misunderstandings and confrontations between Tlingit and Washdonquan during this time, including ones that resulted in violence. In one case, an American ship entered Chilkat Inlet in 1799, and the crew held off what they were certain was to be a surprise attack from the Gus'k'iḳwáan, even as the Tlingit acted willing to trade. Later, the captain learned that a British ship had fired upon and killed or wounded an unknown number of Gus'k'iḳwáan a month before, confirming his suspicion that the Tlingit were seeking retribution against his crew to repay the debt that foreign sailors had inflicted on them. In this regard, many Washtonquan and Gingitchuan merchant captains did learn something about Northwest Coast indigenous cultures, insofar as they could be held collectively responsible for past injustices, and justice might be obtained through violence. As a result, most merchant ships were heavily armed and usually kept their crews on high alert when they were vulnerable, such as when natives came on board their ships to trade. Again, it is important to emphasize the material reality that, at least in most cases, Tlingit communities were pleased to see Gus'k'iḳwáan merchant ships visit their waters. As long as they did not invade Tlingit lands, steal Tlingit resources, or bring violence upon Tlingit people, the foreigners brought desirable items of trade that Tlingit were eager to buy and benefit from. Some level of intercultural understanding, intercultural humility, or honor was often helpful. But as is seen from other episodes of Tlingit history, it was the outsiders who invaded, poached, trespassed, and attempted to colonize Tlingit Ani who inspired the most grievance and the greatest use of force by Tlingit clans. The trans-Pacific fur trade fluctuated constantly over the course of the late 18th and early 19th centuries. The general pattern, simply stated, was that the number of furs taken from the Northwest Coast decreased steadily over the decades, from a peak of tens of thousands in the 1790s and the early 1800s to a few thousand each year in the early 1820s to mere hundreds from the late 1820s onward. Unsurprisingly, the bonanza of hunting by both indigenous and non-indigenous groups was devastating to sea otter populations throughout the northeastern Pacific, and the most valuable furs became more and more difficult to find. In the 1830s and 1840s, the era of open and competitive trade with Gus'k'iḳwáan ships from multiple nations gave way to an era when the Tlingit were increasingly encircled by the imperial claims and projects of the Russians and the British. In the 18th century, Tlingit were already accustomed to engaging in complex commerce with other indigenous peoples from far-off regions of Western North America. As a result, Tlingit communities were fully prepared to participate in the creation of a global fur trade spanning the Pacific Ocean. Tlingit interacted with a variety of visitors from the United States, Europe, and other continents in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, arriving on voyages intended to make imperial claims or purely to make profits from lucrative trade. Regardless of the visitors' intentions, Tlingit found every opportunity to learn and benefit from their encounters with the Gus'k'iḳwáan, strengthening their social, economic, and political standing. Leveraging their access to precious sea otter furs and other resources, Tlingit gained unprecedented access to plentiful metal tools, labor-saving clothing and foodstuffs, and powerful new weapons. Without the draw of the fur trade and the international array of ships that came to Tlingit Ani, Tlingit society may have never reached the heights of wealth, artistic accomplishment, and military armament that it did in the 19th century. However, it is extremely difficult for any historical narrative to strike a balance between illustrating how Northwest Coast indigenous nations during this time period were both enriched and devastated. The indigenous and non-indigenous commercial networks that benefited Tlingit so greatly were the same interconnections that allowed new diseases to ravage Tlingit communities. Kwáan shrank, settlements relocated, territory was lost, and even entire clans may have ceased to exist because of the wave of epidemics produced by Tlingit integration into a global system that freely spread viruses and bacteria to vulnerable populations. It is a major deficiency in the historical record that there are so few examples of Indigenous voices describing the losses they experienced at this time. And it rings hollow for me or anyone else to describe the benefits of commerce and new technology when families were repeatedly ripped apart. Nevertheless, it is clear that even as Tlingit clans and communities suffered unimaginable loss, they made the most of the opportunities presented to them. And when would-be colonial forces made claims to Tlingit or presumptuous foreign merchants attempted to exploit Tlingit resources or violate Tlingit laws, Tlingit refused to accept such indignities. Tlingit insisted on following their own traditions of trade and diplomacy and used threats or outright violence when pushed to do so. During their interactions with the Gus'k'iḳwáan, the people at the base of the clouds, the Tlingit maintained the integrity of their society, the security of their communities, and the sovereignty of their clans. Thank you very much for coming and listening to me this evening. Please feel free to email me if you have any feedback, if you'd like to take a look at my sources, or if you'd just like to be in touch. And I'm not sure how much time we have left, but please let me know what questions you might have. And again, feel free to email me if you have questions or comments at a later time. Thank you, everybody. I guess I'm 4 minutes late, but if anybody has any questions, I would love to hear them. Goodness, Chief.
My name is Richard Jackson. I'm the clan leader of the Tlingit. And Joe Buchanan is the Tlingit leader of the Gus'k'iḳwáan, the land you're on. I really want to say the narrative I heard from Mr. Stanton was very fair in his presentation, very similar to what my grandmother told me, that the women were the traders. In fact, the women were the too. They were the spiritual leaders as well. And that we had no real conflicts. There's even a story of that some of our people were taken on a ship. You've heard that. But the whole thing of my comment is that this man took a lot of time to put this together, and it wasn't a story of grief or of one-sidedness. There's a reciprocal, and he said it at the end, that the devastation which happened, which can be discussed in terms of loss of your community because we had to move away from our land, or possibly the introduction of diseases and ill repute in many ways, which that was discussed. We did come from Tlingit and Haida and Tsimshian, come from a caste system of high society. So we guarded that as much as we could. And unfortunately, as time went by, we moved away from our land. In our case, much of our clans are not here anymore. There used to be many clans, but there's 2 left. And we try to keep that going. And I'm going to work with Peter on that. Actually, we're writing a book now, and I'm going to be using some anthropologists to bring this information together. But I just was impressed with his comments in terms of you're not looking at the narrative of down in the lower 48. They brought that colonialism up here. It wasn't here, but it was brought here in terms of the United States military. In fact, when you talk about us having weapons, Tongass Island was already there. The military moved there, and we had the coats and weapons they sold to us on the island. We worked together. And then a couple years later, or less than a couple years, they moved away. They were guarding the border in Portland Canal. But I was at the elders meeting with Lee and Winona Wallace did, and I told Lee there's this flyer, and it was your presentation. So I called Priscilla Schultz and said it was you. So I said, I better get down here and listen to this, because there are, you get some of these stories that are, in my mind, they're put together in a narrative that he got information and put it down. But when you think of the complexity of us working together in a society, it goes beyond just the Tlinkits. I'm talking about when there was arrests made for voting. William Paul defended his family, his mother's family. And William Paul was from Tongass Island. His dad was Tlingit. Came to Ketchikan, and the jury of not our peers but yours found him innocent, which made us be able to vote 2 years before then. The United States recognized the Native Americans' right to vote. We got that right because they found him innocent. Because he went in to vote, and they said he didn't give up his culture. And he went before 5 non-natives, and they said, well, he could vote, and he let him vote, and then they found out he decided he didn't give it up, and they came here, and they had this trial. And we have equal rights here that began actually in Tlingit with Roy Pradovich, and his wife was from the Sockeye clan, from Haines. And they went to high school here. And they became A and B grand presidents at the same time. My wife and I were grand president of A and B, the second couple. But the history is really complex in terms of what happened. And I could say that at no time in my life did I register any kind of relationship of violence. I went in the Navy and went to school in Los Angeles, and I did see violence. Watts was burned down. That wasn't prior to our equal rights. They didn't get theirs until 1966 or 68. I forget what year it was for the United States. Discrimination, anti-discrimination. We got it in 1945, I think it was. So I just had to say something because I was kind of proud of what he did here. He's a local boy. He did dance with my mother's group. He went to her classes in Johnson O'Malley. I saw him and said, gee, that little kid sure can dance. And I admired it. So I just had to congratulate him on the work he did tonight, and I hope he keeps it up. Thank you.
I appreciate it. Any other questions or comments?
For those that don't know me, my name is Winona Wallace, and I'm from Saxman. I have gotten to know Peter through his wife, Christina. She's a nurse at the Ketchikan Medical Center, and I just love the both of them. Peter, you present yourself very humble, and that's an attribute for you. And I think that the way that you've given this history is just, timeline. It felt really good to hear that. I compared it to my own people and what was happening on Navajo land and what was happening here. One of the questions I have is, have you ever gone to, would it be Spain, that people have collections? And wouldn't it be so neat to talk to some of the elders in Spain to gather even more information?
Yeah, that is. Thank you. That is absolutely on my list, that I need to go to Madrid and see some of these items that featured just a few pictures of in the slideshow, because those really were the first. Yeah, I mean, they were the first items, pieces of art, pieces of heritage that were taken from this land and then saved and preserved somewhere else from 1791. And so there are still a few items that are in Museo de America in Madrid. And I've got to go there and see those at some point, but I have not yet had the opportunity to do that. That would be pretty amazing. Thanks. Last opportunity. Any other questions? All right. I'll just say, thank you very much again for coming out tonight. Hope you have a great night.